some people would say, okay, we have a climate crisis, so we've got to shift as quickly as possible as we can from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, which is right. But somehow the idea that by doing that, we can just sort of carry on, in the way that we have been otherwise. I mean, I think that's a misunderstanding. We have a much greater crisis here. And what it fundamentally goes back to is this sense of separation from the earth, that we feel our well-being, therefore, is separate from the well-being of the earth, and that therefore we can kind of exploit it and use it in any way we want. And I think we can understand the ecological crisis as kind of the karma built into that way of relating and exploiting the earth. The other really important thing, which I end up talking about more often, is I think Buddhism has this idea of the bodhisattva path, the idea that it's not simply that we want to become awakened simply for our own benefit, but much more so that we want to awaken in order to be of service to everyone.
So another episode of the Conscient Podcast. I'm joined by David Loy, who's in Colorado, I believe, David?
That's right, just outside Boulder.
Nice to meet you. Thanks for taking the time. What I have done with other guests is ask them to start by introducing themselves. I'll have a link to your bio on the web, but just give us an idea of who you are, where you come from, and then we'll have a few questions after that.
Sure. So I've had a career as a professor of philosophy, mostly Buddhist and comparative philosophy, but I've also been very interested in Zen practice. So I lived in Japan for quite a while, and I sometimes am a Zen teacher, and also maybe more relevant to this show is I'm one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center up in the mountains above Boulder, and I've also written on what's called Eco-Dharma, looking at Buddhist and related teachings from looking at the ecological implications of those teachings.
The definition of reality in Buddhism. Buddhism seeks to address any disparity between a person's view of reality and the actual state of things. We'll get to that in a second. As you know, I'm also a Zen practitioner, and when I wrote this piece for the second season called Reality, I was looking at not only reality from a Zen point of view, but also the notion of denial and how we don't necessarily acknowledge reality. So maybe we start from there. How does obviously the term reality is important in Buddhism, but how do you respond to somebody sort of searching for the true sense of reality?
This is a really important question in Buddhism generally, because certainly from a Zen perspective, I think the idea is that our normal way of experiencing the world, you could say our sense of ourselves is separate from other people and the rest of the world, seeing the world as a collection of separate things, that this is just one way to experience the world and that there are other ways. In modern language, you could say that our usual way of experiencing is a construct. It's a psychological and social construct that we sort of buy into as we learn language and grow up. And I mean, there's a lot of important things about that concept, but the other issue is that it's not the only way of experiencing the world. It's not the only way of experiencing ourselves. And through something like Zen practice, it's possible to open up and see this other aspect of reality.
My own understanding and perception of reality have been transformed since I started writing this episode. Yuval Harari's statement about how fictional stories are not a biological reality shook me up and woke me up. More and more, I now see, and more importantly, I now feel in my bones the state of things as they actually exist, without social filters or unsustainable stories blocking the way.
Now, this is kind of tricky too, because in some types of Buddhism, like in other religions, they can understand the goal, awakening, as somehow ultimately about transcending or escaping this world. And I think it's a much better way to understand it is that it's really kind of the opposite. It's that our usual way of experiencing the world, where we feel separate from it, is actually the problem. So it's more sort of opening up to the world, experiencing our relationship to it much more deeply than we usually do.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly your writings, there's an article you wrote called Awakening in the Age of Climate Change, which was one of the first things I wrote and then read. And then I read the Eco-Dharma book. And it goes, I mean, I encourage people to read it because you explain the climate crisis very clearly in the sort of scientific or logical language, and then you go into the role of Buddhism. So could you maybe tell us about the Eco-Dharma book in particular, why you wrote it, and what are some of the key messages that you're trying to transmit through that writing?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's worth mentioning that eco-dharma is a new term. It's not at all traditional. And obviously, as I said before, it's about looking at the ecological implications of Buddhist and related teachings. It's been quite striking to me that actually Buddhism, including Zen, I think we've been fairly slow in sort of waking up to this. It is a new direction, a new focus. This in itself isn't a problem, in the sense that when you look at the history of Buddhism, say in Asia, it has a history. I mean, Buddhism emphasizes impermanence and insubstantiality from the very beginning. And we can see how that has played out as Buddhism spread throughout Asia and transformed as it, went to new cultures and new historical circumstances. And so I think part of the big challenge we face today as Buddhism comes not just to the West, but to the modern world is, how does Buddhism need to change so that it can be most liberative, so that it can be most helpful to us today? And certainly a very important part of that is looking at the resources available within Buddhism to help us understand and respond to the kind of ecological challenges we have now.
Zen teacher David Loy. The Buddhist solution to this predicament is not to get rid of the self, because there is no such thing to get rid of. The sense of self needs to be deconstructed, forgotten in meditation, and reconstructed, replacing the three poisons of greed, ill will, and delusion with generosity, loving kindness, and the wisdom that recognizes our interdependence. Just as there is no self to get rid of, we cannot return to nature because we've never been apart from it. But we can realize our non-duality with it and begin to live in ways that accord with that realization.
This, what I see as a really fascinating parallel between what Buddhism has always had to say about our individual predicament, the delusion of separation and the kind of suffering built into that, and our collective predicament today in relationship to the natural world. That again, what's happened historically is basically we've come to feel quite separate from the earth, from the natural world, and built into that, I think, ultimately are the sources of the kind of ecological problems we face today. So that the fundamental challenge, I mean, some people would say, okay, we have a climate crisis, so we've got to shift as quickly as possible as we can from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, which is right. But somehow the idea that by doing that, we can just sort of carry on, in the way that we have been otherwise. I mean, I think that's a misunderstanding. We have a much greater crisis here. And what it fundamentally goes back to is this sense of separation from the earth, that we feel our well-being, therefore, is separate from the well-being of the earth, and that therefore we can kind of exploit it and use it in any way we want. And I think we can understand the ecological crisis as kind of the karma built into that way of relating and exploiting the earth. So that's part of what stands out for me. The other really important thing, which I end up talking about more often, is I think Buddhism has this idea of the bodhisattva path, the idea that it's not simply that we want to become awakened simply for our own benefit, but much more so that we want to awaken in order to be of service to everyone. I remember, one of the great Japanese teachers, Kukai, said, the measure of our enlightenment is how we serve others. And I think that is especially important nowadays when we, consider, okay, how do we understand our Buddhist practice today? Aren't we really feeling more and more drawn to do whatever we can, not only in our own individual lifestyles, but also address the institutional problems that are causing the ecological crisis? Sorry, that was a rather long response to your question.
But it's a lot of information, and it's important to think about what Buddhism has done traditionally in times of conflict, right? Because being pacific or non-aggressive is a state in and of itself. But in a crisis like our own, and your book really describes it very well, and somewhat harshly, in the sense that you are telling the truth, of what is likely to happen. I also had thought about what do spiritual movements around the world, how do they organize themselves? And I'm seeing them organize themselves. I know you're involved with a number of different educational and projects that are meant to use the Dharma for social good. And certainly Thich Nhat Hanh and others have done that, but others are more literally monkish or hermetic in the way that they approach their practice. And that's fine too. But for me, as a lay practitioner, it's a really good question as to how will I apply the wonderful teachings of a Zen practice. And I'm also an artist, right? And art plays an important role in Zen practice as well, as a way to become more aware of one's surroundings and so on. So maybe you could talk a bit more about how you see the Dharma being used in a more proactive way in society. What are we not doing in the Buddhist communities to have a more impact? Yeah.
There's a number of ways to go there. I mean, one of them is brings us back to this very important distinction, I think, between grief and despair. I think that just about all of us who are paying attention to what's going on now, I think we all tend to have a lot of grief, and yet it tends to be repressed or suppressed in one form or the other. Partly because we're afraid to touch that. It's just so powerful, and also because often we have a sense of powerlessness.
Journalist Dal Jamal. My heart breaks for what we have done and are doing to the planet. I grieve. Yet this ongoing process has become more like peeling back the layers of an onion. There is always more work to do as the crisis we have created for ourselves continues to unfold. And somewhere along the line, I surrendered my attachment to any results that might stem from my work. I am hope, free.
Touching it maybe won't be of any use because we won't know where to go with that. I think one thing that Buddhism helps us with is this distinction between grief. Grief is a feeling. Grief is something that we feel right now, or rather we are avoiding feeling right now. And one of the things we do up in our Eco-Dharma Center retreats is helping people get in touch with that. Because as long as we are denying that, there's a sense of repression of possibilities as well. Because we tend to confuse it with despair. Despair is a different sort of thing. Despair is much more of a head trip or a conclusion about the future. It's so easy to get caught up in these dualities, these conceptual dualities of hope and despair, or optimism and pessimism, where the mind can sort of bounce from one to the other. And feeling grief is actually something very different from that. It's what happens in our retreats is because you have a bunch of people living together 24/7 normally, and spending a lot of time outdoors, meditating together. We help each other get in touch with our grief. And what we find as a result of that is there's something really empowering about it, in that we often feel sort of inspired by each other to sort of become more engaged than we otherwise would. So that's a long way or one way of answering your question about, what role Zen, or we could generalize Buddhist practice might have to offer here. It's not simply a matter of helping us sort of understand in some sort of intellectual or conceptual way, but I think we've actually got to feel what that means. And part of the importance of that feeling is if we really get in touch with our grief, part of what's transformative about it is that it tends to cut through a lot of the bullshit of our lives. When we see what's going on, it's really hard to play the usual sort of professional success games that society encourages us to play, or to get caught up in the consumerism, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the real religion of the modern era. I think those are really important ways in which meditation practice can contribute to our liberation from those kinds of traps.
Well, there's certainly a lot of activity going on in ecological grief and ecological anxiety. I've been following that and doing support groups and those kinds of things. And not everyone's going to have a meditative practice or a sitting practice, but they certainly have. I think there is a lot to learn from the 2,600-year traditions of Buddhism. Historian Paul Krauss. For Francis Bacon, man is superior to nature. But man is also alienated from nature. Nature is harsh and unforgiving, and something that needs to be conquered. Rather than seeing man as part of the web of nature, Bacon sees man as existing in a natural empire. What are your thoughts on the role that arts and culture plays, both in Buddhist practice, but also in relation to the ecological crisis?
So, yeah, well, as you mentioned, I've written a little book on stories. The world is made of stories, and if you include in the arts and the culture the stories that we tell ourselves, which of course, should be included, I think we can see how what we're experiencing now, the sort of mess that we've gotten ourselves into, that it's very much connected with particular stories. I mean, go back to Genesis in the Old Testament, or the Jewish Bible, where, we're created to be special, where we're on the earth, but in a way, the earth is sort of there for us to use and abuse. Now, there's different ways of interpreting Genesis, but that's certainly a very common one. So that as the foundation of a fundamental religious story about who we are, what it means to be human, and connecting that also with the way that so often religion is ultimately about supposedly transcending this world, going to somewhere better, an eternity with God in heaven or whatever. I mean, I think those stories are very foundational in a deep way that I think we're not even necessarily conscious of. But one of the important things clearly that we need to do is to have alternative types of stories that talk about us not as special or different from all the other species, but emphasize that we too, humans, are simply one of the many ways in which the natural world is manifesting here, and how, insofar as we are special in the sense that we have a certain kind of power from language and technology, that rather than understanding that as simply something we should use, for our own pleasure and benefits, seeing that there's a sense of responsibility built into that when we realize that we're part of the earth, that we're a manifestation of the earth, then in a way, I think that answers a very profound question about the meaning of life. I mean, we're here to work for the well-being, the flourishing of the whole, and so how wonderful it is if we can have stories that emphasize that instead, and also stories. I mean, they can happen on that more abstract level, but also stories of all sorts, art and music of all sorts, that encourages this sense of connection, this sense of non-duality with the earth and the rest of the natural world. It seems to me, if we don't have stories, if we don't have other types of art and music that encourage that, then I think something is there's a real flaw there that needs to be fixed.
Dharma teacher Catherine Ingram. Despite having caused so much destruction, it is important to consider the wide spectrum of possibilities that make up human life. Yes, on one end of that spectrum is greed, cruelty, and ignorance. On the other end is kindness, compassion, and wisdom. We are imbued with great creativity, brilliant communication, and extraordinary appreciation of and talent for music and other forms of art. There is no other known creature whose spectrum of consciousness is as wide and varied as our own. Well, before we end, I want to talk a little bit about hope, because your book is not about hope in the sort of yes or no kind of way, but how do you feel now about some people accept that the civilization collapse is inevitable and that we just have to adapt, and but where are you at on that spectrum of hope and hope?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. I think again, for those who are paying attention, our situation is very difficult, and we're not going. It's pretty clear we're in for some difficult times. Just how difficult they're going to be, and what we can do to make them less difficult. It's it's not always clear there. It's interesting how this fits into what in Zen we talk about as don't know mind, right? Don't know mind in the sense of we don't necessarily know what's happening. We don't necessarily know what's possible, and very often I think that would be seen as something very disempowering. But it's interesting how in Zen we emphasize that is the opposite, that we don't need to know all of that. It's more about getting in touch with what's happening right here and now, and responding appropriately as well as we can given what we do see. I think that ultimately for the bodhisattva path, such as I mentioned earlier, it's something that goes beyond hope and despair. It's again, there's that duality that I think it's dangerous to get too much caught up in that. Rather, I think we need to realize that at this particular crucial point in history, and here I'm reminded of something Noam Chomsky said in an interview last year, where he said, this is the most dangerous time ever in human history. Interesting that he would, as a history buff, I sort of immediately started to look for counterexamples, but frankly, I couldn't find any. I think he's right. I think this is absolutely crucial moment. And the question really is, what are we called upon to do right now, not knowing necessarily what's going to come out of it? I think essential to the bodhisattva path is what many religious traditions emphasize as non-attachment, in this case, non-attachment to results. I think our fundamental task at this point is doing the very best we can, being strategic, trying to do things, and yet accepting that we can't control that. We don't know whether anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. And that's not only okay, there's something joyful in that. We do it because it's the right thing to do, and we can't control the outcome. And I think that is really one of the main ways that the Zen or the Buddhist path generally needs to encounter or interact with the kind of challenges that we're facing today.
Well, that's very helpful, because that I find also to be, I wouldn't use the word hopeful. I find that it's a path that one can take that feels real, that feels connected. You don't know when you're going to die either. So you just live every moment, but you make every effort you can, and you look at the future generations in the eye, and you anticipate the life that they should have, food, housing, just at least the basics. And you say, well, why can't we provide that as they have been provided for us? So there's so much more we could talk about, but I want to remind their listeners that you're the author of a book called Eco-Dharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis, and that I really recommend it for those who are even mildly interested in Buddhism and Zen and the connections to the ecological crisis. It's actually not a downer. It's a very uplifting. It's an uplifting book, but you start by, and the executive summary is really excellent, by the way. So really, it's a pleasure to read. So thanks for that. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we end? Is there anything we haven't covered?
Well, just a quick plug. There's lots more on my website, davidloy.org, and also the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center. We have our own website, so people who are interested in these issues might like to follow up by checking out those. I also want to thank you, Claude, for this opportunity, for this invitation. These ideas are so important, I think, and I really appreciate your shared concern to express them.
Well, thank you, and we will keep in touch, probably talk again.
Hope so. Thank you, Claude. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.